This is a Geek Leader podcast, and I'm your host, John Rauda. This show is all about helping us grow as leaders, become better technologists, and improve our lives both at work and at home. I hope you enjoy the show and learn a lot. Hello, world, and welcome to episode 214 of Geek Leader Podcast. I'm your host, John Rauda, and today's sponsor is Private Internet Access. If you've ever surfed the web and wanted to do it securely, especially when you're traveling or using someone else's network, you definitely need private internet access. Private internet access allows you to have a secure VPN without them logging what data what you're doing, what transactions you're making, or anything like that, to connect to anywhere in the world. You can also change your default location so it appears as if you're coming from a different place. Why is this helpful, you say? If you're not doing anything nefarious, well, it's really helpful if you want to test DNS resolution from different places and different time zones. It's a really cool tool, and it's not very expensive at all. You can get plans starting at $3.99 a month, and you can find out more by going to geekleader.com/VPN. Again, that's geekleader.com/VPN. All right, Geek Leaders. Today on the show, I've got Rick Maurer, and he's a speaker, author, consultant, and an expert helping leaders avoid resistance to change. And he's been around for quite some time when it comes to the field of getting through resistance, helping leaders, consulting leaders, and he's been sought after by the Wall Street Journal, CNBC, NBC Nightly News, Fortune, and many others. He's also helped some of the largest companies, advise their leaders and help them become better leaders. So with all that being said, Rick, welcome to the show.
Thanks, John. It's good to be here.
Rick, if you don't mind, tell the audience just a little bit about how you got to where you are today and kind of what your journey's been like through leadership.
Yeah, it's going to sound like it's going to be a long story. It's not. When I was in graduate school, I was working with emotionally disturbed kids in schools. And turns out it was a radical program at the time. I didn't realize that. And the philosophy was a lot of these kids aren't disturbed. It's the schools that are disturbed. And if you can change schools, you'll have fewer kids acting crazy, acting disturbed. Mm-hmm. And I bought that then. And I went into my first job. So I had never had a real job before. I walk in, I have no experience. And I'm saying to teachers who have 30 years experience, hi, I'm here to help. And you can imagine how that went over. They go, well, you sit right over there, young man. As soon as we need your help, we're going to call you. I mean, everything I did, I kept thinking I had these good ideas and nothing was working. And that experience stayed with me. And when I started consulting, a lot of my clients started saying, God, we face all this resistance. I mean, resistance became this theme that they talked about. And the stuff I was reading on resistance really didn't make much sense to me. In fact, I did a literature search of business press, and one verb always was, not always, but most of the time appeared along with resistance to change, and that was overcome. We've got to overcome resistance. Mm-hmm. And now that sounds appealing. The problem is, I mean, if your listeners think about when somebody has tried to get you to overcome your resistance to buying something, to going somewhere, what happens? It just doubles your resistance, and they start pushing back. And so I started studying resistance more through psychology and actually through some of the martial arts and talking about how you use the resistance. And I came up with my own theory and wrote a book about it called Beyond the Wall of Resistance. And this was 1996. And I had never written anything like that before. And I was saying basically what you think right now is wrong. And I really thought I may be doing something bad for my career by doing that. And as it turns out, people started calling and said, could you help us? And that quickly became the foundation for everything I do. So there's still so much to learn. And that's why it stayed kind of top of mind for me all these years. In fact, I just this year released a new book, and it's all based on that theory that I began to develop back in the 90s.
And tell me a little bit about when it comes to resistance and the it's hard for me to put this into words, but like as a leader, sometimes you'll come up with an idea, especially if you're a new leader, you're green in your field, and you have this idea that you want to push through, and you get this same thing like, well, that's just not how we do it here,
Yes.
or for example, I became about 5 years ago, I took a new role leading a new team, and in that team, I kept getting this thing like, well, that's just not how we do it. We've never done it that way. Is that the most common kind of resistance that you see, or is there something else that's bigger than that I haven't encountered yet?
No, that's a big one. That is a big one. John, that's a great idea. Yeah, we'll take that under advisement. And that's the last you ever hear of it. It just
disappears
yes.
into the ether somewhere.
Yeah. But that kind of what they're saying is not as important as why they're saying it and what's behind what they're saying. And when I first started working with the resistance, and the model I use is I found that there are like three kinds of things. I call them levels. And the first is, I don't get it. So you're the new leader and you say, hey, I got this great idea. And they say, oh, that's not how we do it here. They may understand what you're saying perfectly. They might even be able to do a presentation on what you're saying. So if that's the case, if you keep trying to sell it based on its merits, its benefits, and all of that, you're making a mistake, because the resistance, in other words, their reluctance, isn't coming from lack of understanding. And that's a big mistake we make a lot. We over-explain when in fact the problem sometimes is elsewhere. But one thing can be they just don't understand it. The second is they don't like it. And this is an emotional reaction based on fear. So something about your idea scares them or worries them. And my guess would be that a big part of you as a new leader, you're getting that is, oh no, another new person here, and he's got some idea that can fix something that isn't broken. Boy, I'm going to have to start working weekends. I'm going to, so suddenly something that you haven't said is like, oh, people are reacting in very strong, almost survival ways. And when that happens, it's very, very difficult for people, that includes you and me, for people to take in any facts and figures. Because so for instance, let's say I'm a leader and the people listening, we're doing a Zoom call for our organization. And I just happen to say, when I'm talking about this change, I happen to use the word downsizing. And I may even in the next sentence say, and downsize isn't going to happen here, but it's too late. I've already used that word, and people's brains have started firing, as if a tiger was let loose in the office, and it's very difficult for them to hear anything else. So that emotional thing's a big one. So I don't get it. I don't like it. The third one is I don't like you. And what I really mean by that is they don't have trust and confidence in you. So when you were a new leader, or I was a new teacher back then, they got, why does he think he can help us? We've been doing this for 20 years. And so we lack the credibility. Or perhaps we've had a lot of experience, and they go, every few months he comes in with this new idea. He's read a book or listened to some podcast, and he's got this brand new idea. And we go, oh, why does he do that? So any of those can cause the resistance. The problem is what people say out loud often isn't directly related to what the real fear is, because it's often dangerous to say, hey, I think you're an idiot, or I'm scared to death, that kind of thing. So,
yeah, absolutely. And, so one of the things that I've noticed and I've experienced over time is when you run into setbacks and resistance, your energy kind of runs out. You run out of the ability to push through and continue to come up with new ideas and continue to try, because you feel like, what's the use? What advice do you have for a leader? Let's say you've been managing a team for 3 or 4 years, and you're getting to that point now where you're not seeing the change that you expected to see at this point, and you're getting frustrated. You have that, you hear those nice things like, oh, that's a great idea, but it's just not going to work for us. Or you hear nothing, like you were talking about before. What do you do to revive yourself and to push forward and to get that energy back?
Okay. First of all, that's a really good question. The first thing I would do is get really curious about why they're not excited about my idea, or why they're dragging their feet or resisting. Use whatever word you want, but you're not getting the support you need. And I would really look at, so Do they understand what I'm talking about? What's their reaction to it? And do they trust me? And obviously, in a lot of places, you can't ask that directly. So I was working with a group, and they were a planning group, and they're working on a big change that was going to have a huge impact on the organization. It was called business process reengineering. And at the time, it was very, very controversial. I mean, people just were scared. And so I'm just there teaching these people. And one of the people said, next week, the bomb is going to drop. And everybody says, oh, yeah. And I said, what are you doing next week? And they said, we're having a meeting with all the stakeholders. And that's where we go over the first part of the plan. Oh, they're going to hate it. And what should we do? And I did not have a magic answer. But what I ended up coming up with, which I call the list, is key to my work all the time. And I would suggest to you or to anybody listening, the creation of this list is really important. So they're looking at me like for advice, and I didn't know what to say. So I said, hey, everybody here knows somebody who's going to be at that meeting, right? And everybody said, yeah. And I said, what's going to be on their minds? And people started telling me. And I ended up filling a flip chart up with stuff. And then I said, all right, so which of these things, everything on the list, by the way, they came up with was negative. And that's usually not the case. But in this case, everything was negative. And I said, okay, so which of these are level one? Like people don't get it. You know, it's facts and figures and all of that. And so there were a couple things there. And I underlined that, let's say, with green. And then I said, which of these have to do with fear? You know, I could lose my job. I could lose face. I could lose control. And there's a lot of them there. So I used a different color. And I said, which of these have to do with you? They don't trust you. And once again, I used another colored marker. And the guy who had said the bomb is going to drop said, oh, that's why the bomb is going to drop. And everybody said, what are you talking about? He said, look at that. We designed that entire meeting to deal with level one stuff, timelines, goals and objectives, deliverables, very necessary stuff. But he said, we're missing the energy that they're walking in with, is that they're scared and they don't trust us. And so just having that information can give you options. And here's what these leaders did brilliantly. And these were middle level people. These weren't the senior leaders in the organization. They turned to the consultant they were working with on the project and to me and said, could we take the next hour and redesign that meeting? And so, of course, we said yes. They turned their chairs around. They did not call on us for help. But what they did is they took the same meeting, the same group of people, the same bad coffee, and said, how do we make this a meeting that actually starts to help dissipate some of that fear? What can we do? And how can we lead the meeting in a way that they might actually start to trust us more? And when I checked in with them after that follow-up meeting, they said it went brilliantly. They said, not everybody's on board, but a lot of people are. So the first thing you got to do is you got to know what's gone on. So when somebody says, hey, yeah, we've never done it that way before, like what's clearly they're saying that, but what's behind that? And so you got to get the information, and easy ways to do it are the way that I did it. Say, think about somebody else, or talk to somebody over lunch. Like there probably are going to be 2 or 3 people who are willing to tell it like it is. Mm-hmm. And often they can be a little too dramatic and go too far, but they can also give you information that you wouldn't have gotten anywhere else. And if you're not getting that information, I would keep looking, because if you take any action without that information, it's like traveling in a storm in unknown terrain with no GPS. You know, it's just, you might be successful, but there's a really good chance you're going to go off the road.
Yeah, for sure. So, you talked about, starting forward before the meeting or before the, with an intention for energy. How do you add energy to like an existing plan or a project that's already underway that you see is falling apart?
Well, yeah, thank you for that question. This book that I just wrote, and by the way, it's called Seizing Moments of Possibility, and the book is free, by the way. It's as a PDF on my website. But the idea here is, how can you begin to blend energy into the plan? Because too often we're so focused on the technical part, what can we do? And so one of the things we can do is start small. Consultants will try to sell you a lot of things, and I'm a consultant, and I try to to limit that. But I can get excited about stuff, and sometimes people will say yes when they don't really know what they're saying yes to, and that's just not a good thing. So what I say to my clients is, I say, look, start easy. The first thing to do is do no harm, and start observing people in meetings. And it's hard to look at yourself at first. So watch other people as they're trying to get a point across and just notice what's going on. When it works, how come? How come people got excited and started leaning forward and adding to it? And in other meetings, it just fell silent. It was like Mount Rushmore, and that observation is key. The great baseball player and worldly philosopher Yogi Berra once said, you can observe a lot just by watching. And I really recommend to my clients and to anybody else who will listen, observation is probably better than taking another training course or reading another book, because you're seeing what's going on. And that is a great starting point. And then I would say, let me take an existing meeting. So let's just imagine that tomorrow we're all going to be in a meeting at 9 o'clock, and it's a weekly meeting, and we go, oh no, I got that meeting again. And if you have any control over that meeting, what's one small thing that you could do that might make it a better meeting? And I'm talking about really small. One thing I know a paint company did, they said, we always have refreshments before big meetings. So we decided we're going to have the refreshments afterwards and let everybody know. And then we're just going to hang out, and we're not going to be on our phones, and we're not going to talk to each other. We're just going to be there available for conversations. And they started learning a lot. So just getting there a few minutes early and hanging out, staying a few minutes late, you can learn an incredible amount of stuff. Or if I was working with a client and they were doing what's called an all hands meeting or town hall meeting. And the idea was that they really wanted to hear from people, but they got so taken with their own presentations that out of a 90-minute meeting, they'd already used 80 with them talking to an audience of 400 people. And then they said, oh, well, we don't have much time left, but we got time for a couple of questions. That was a huge wasted opportunity. What they could have done is say, all right, we're going to limit our presentation to 30 minutes or to 20 minutes, and we're going to use the rest of the time for question and answer. So there can be some really simple things that you can do. And depending on your comfort level, like I know some leaders who could get up in front of a whole big group and say, hey, what's going on? What's wrong? And they could take whatever was dished out. Mm-hmm. And other leaders would rather die than do something like that. So you've got to pick what's comfortable for you to begin to open up the meeting.
So let me ask you this. One of the things that I've heard a lot lately, especially now with COVID and people working remotely, is, and I was actually talking to someone just yesterday, and they said one of the problems that are shortcomings that they're seeing now is that time where they would run into people serendipitously. I don't know if that's a real word or not, but they would just run into people at their desk or in the hallway, and they would have these like brief conversations. And they say now they're not having that. They're only having meetings. They're not having those catch up moments at the water cooler or whatever. What can we do in this remote work environment to try to get that back?
Yeah, wow. Yeah, that really is a big one. And I'm happy to say that it's at least here in the States, it's starting to shift back to, maybe not fully back to things, but that lack of ability just to hang out, to have a cup of coffee, to meet somebody in a hall is missing. And one of the things that I try to do is have, like, one thing is maybe to have informal meetings and say, hey, with small groups of people, once you get up to, over 10 people, it's not small anymore. In fact, but I would say, you don't want to hurt people's feelings, but let's say you might say, hey, Betty and Tom and Chris, I'd just like to have a brief chat with the three of you about blah, blah, blah this week. Could we do it just off the record, cup of coffee in hand, as if we're sitting down over coffee? And basically, as some clients of mine called it, be on a listening tour. Your goal there is to learn from them. So if you use all that time over that virtual cup of coffee to talk, you're wasting it.
Yeah.
And if you use that time and put up slides, you're wasting it. The idea is that you're sitting there and saying, hey, I'm kind of confused. I don't want you to name names, but things are going a whole lot slower on this project than I ever thought. Or are people excited about this? I'm having a really hard time reading the room. Once you've asked the question, the key next step is shut up. And that's a hard one. That's a really hard one because we want to fill up that airspace, but just being silent and people know, wow, he's serious. And so after you shut up and they say what they're going to say, don't justify. Well, see, John, the reason we did that is because as soon as I start to do that, you're going, he didn't want to hear that. So the best thing is you ask the question, you listen. If you don't understand it, you ask for clarification and then say, thank you. What else? But make it informal and make it fairly short, just like you would be meeting somebody in a hallway or over a cup of coffee. So it's not this big deal production.
Yeah. It's still, I don't know. I think it's probably part of it's just willpower, because it feels awkward to just not have an agenda per se for, because I kind of feel guilty, like I'm taking up their time. Whereas if I just run into someone, I don't mind having a 10-minute conversation about something, but I feel guilty, like, pursuing that person and pulling that time out, and it's probably just me.
And no, it isn't just you. And I think that's a good consideration. And what I would, I'm tempted to say get over it, but but I'm not going to say that because
you probably should.
Well, I had that same problem, but I think it's really important for you yourself and to be really clear why this is valuable, and then say to them, hey, I really appreciate you taking 10 minutes because I want to ask you about blah, blah, blah. Here's why that's so important to me. And then at the end of the 10 minutes, say, I want to keep to our time. I appreciate that. Here's what I got from it. Or here's what it's given me to think about, so that they know that this was probably a pretty good use of time, that it wasn't, like if they walk away going, why did he call us together? That was a missed opportunity. So I just be real clear about, hey, here's what I need some information on. And then at the end, just say, boy, you give me some stuff to think about. Here's what I'm going to think about 1, 2, and 3. I think can start to shift that from being wasted time to, wow, that was pretty valuable.
Yeah. Yeah. I can definitely see it that way. And if you do that, then it kind of feels like you're, hopefully at the end of that conversation, they're going to want to do this again. They're going to want to reach out to you.
Yes.
And you're not going to be the one always initiating.
Yeah. Can I give you a bigger deal version of that?
Yeah, definitely.
Okay. There's a government agency that used to have these projects that would go way over budget, way over time, and not deliver very well.
All of them?
Yeah. Yeah. And anyway, this one agency, and they were working with a lot of other agencies as well as local governments and community groups and that. And so when they start a project, they would have to contract with all kinds of people who build roads and surveyed and blah, 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 blah. And so they started holding a meeting, and I call it a what if meeting because they didn't have a name for it. And actually, I think that's pretty good. They didn't have a name for it. And they would pull the people together, like let's say there's 30, 40 people in the room. And they'd say, everybody knows what this project is because you all got a contract and you all signed on. Mm-hmm. And when I look around the room, there are probably at least decades worth of experience on projects like these. So we want to learn about that. And so what we'd like you to do is identify what could go wrong. We've already decided what we're going to do. What could go wrong? And they put the people at tables so they're not working with their best buddy. So if you and I work together all the time, John, they're going to put us at different tables. Mm-hmm. And so at each table, we'd just start to brainstorm. And they said they would fill the room up with flip chart paper. And they would say then, wow, that's a lot of stuff. Let's underline those or put dots by those that are really critical. These things could really stop the thing. And once they've done that, and now there's a lot of energy in the room because people are allowed to talk about negative stuff. Mm-hmm. And there's a reason for it. And that just tends to energize people and say, all right, so this table over here, take this one item right here, and this table over here, take that other item. And what I'd like you to do is come up with what are the steps that you will do if that problem happens. And they had to be specific. It couldn't be, well, we'll have cooperation and teamwork and good, communication. Those are platitudes. They said, the thing will be, John will call someone in Rick's office and you're going to come to a decision and agreement on A, B, and C. Bam. Very clear. And so if a problem came up, and everybody then had to agree or not to abide by those things, or it didn't get it on the final list. So now if a problem came up, like in one case, we're building an interstate where I grew up, and the people building the road were doing a great job. The people building the bridge were doing a good job. And fortunately, somebody realized that road is not going to hit where the bridge is. So you want to have a conversation quickly about that thing. So what they could do is they could just turn to whatever the page was in this little booklet they had just created and say, Mary's supposed to call Chris, and they're supposed to have a conversation about blah, blah, and come to agreement. Well, they found out a couple of really important things. One is that when problems came up, they had a way to begin to address it quickly. They didn't have to worry about, I don't know if I have the authority, I blah, 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 blah. They did. But the second thing they didn't expect is fewer problems came up. And the reason, I believe, is they started to build relationships in that what if meeting. And you could do that with a group of 5 people. I mean, it doesn't have to be 40. It's like, hey, we've got this project starting and in our department or wherever, and everybody here has been around for a long time. What could go wrong? Let's just brainstorm. And brainstorming means you just start writing it down without discussion. And you, as the leader, definitely do not comment on those items as they go up. It's important just to kind of open the floodgates and let the stuff to get out. And then you could do exactly what that group did. Say, all right, so let's come up with some plans. So if the problem happens, and what I like about it, it's looking at if the problem happens rather than how do we avoid it in the first place. I'm a big fan of avoiding in the first place, but it's actually safer to talk about what they're already doing, because then they start to see, here's what we do wrong. And suddenly that they weren't having as many problems.
Yeah, definitely. So I'm totally for always getting information out early, talking about it, and get ahead of the problems. But what happens if you don't? What happens if you're behind? The curve on some of these things and these topics, because these are all great. But what happens if you find yourself in the position where you didn't do what you were supposed to do, and now you have to get out of it?
Okay. You're toast. There's nothing you can do. No. First of all, the thing you can do is be honest with yourself. Just if I've seen a lot of people live in denial for a very long time. And especially when the people around them knew this thing was going to hell in a handbasket. But the leaders either couldn't see it, or they were afraid to talk about it. So a big deal is just noticing it and then saying, hey, this project is about to go off the rails, or nobody seems to be energized by it. As a CEO said to me once, he said, all I was getting was malicious compliance. People were doing just enough so I'd keep walking down the hall. But say, okay, we're serious about this. What do we do to get back on track? And if you have some assumptions, you can throw them in. And some of the things that often happen, I'll just give you I have this assessment tool that called the batteries not included map, and it just looks at pockets of energy. And then I'll ask clients, and is all right. So on a typical project, what happens to energy? Where does it get high? Does it ever drop off? That sort of thing. And there's nothing magical about that. It's a pretty simple kind of line. And I'll say, well, why did it start dropping off? And usually people can say, it was that moment. For instance, we didn't have the key players involved when we were starting to talk about, we've got to do something. There's some urgency. And so the first time we ever talked to them was once we were into the planning phase, and they're still going, why are we talking about this? So that's one. Another big one is we forget to bring in some of the key players ever. I remember working with a software development company. They said we left the mail room out of our planning. It's not, we weren't trying to be, excluding. We just never even thought of them. And they stopped the entire project. I'm not quite sure how they stopped it, but they had to back up 6 months. So the first thing would be to identify what's going on and then say, all right, why did it go on? Now, what can we do? And here's what I think is really good news is when you have that honest conversation, and I'll say to people, well, what could you have done? And they go, oh, well, blah, 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 blah. Well, could you do that now? And almost always the answer is, oh, yeah. Yeah, we could pull those people in. And so let's say one of the things, this is a big one, it was we don't include some key players. I would call them in and I'd say, we made a big mistake. And we left you out of the loop. And we really need your help. In fact, a friend of mine used to be the head of Huffy Bicycles, John Mariotti. Mm-hmm. And Huffy is kind of a regular people bike. It's not a racer's bike or anything. And they were competing against Schwinn, which at the time was like the manufacturer. And they were really trying to improve quality, but they left out the first line supervisors thinking, oh, these are a bunch of old guys, because it was guys at the time. And they're going to be set in their way. They had all these assumptions. And somebody said, because they're the natural leaders here and we left them out. And then people said, well, that's because they're old guys. I said, no, we never asked them. So they met with the first line supervisors and said, we made a big mistake. You guys are the natural leaders here, and we left you out of the loop. And we think this is critically important to our survival, and we need your help. Here's why we think quality improvement is absolutely what we've got to do right now. And a lot of these supervisors said, wow, I had no idea. I mean, nobody ever tells us. I mean, we just do what we're doing, how critical it was. And John said something like 70% said, yeah, what can we do to help? And then the others realized this world is changing and maybe it's time to take retirement. They said, but we became a success. In fact, if you look at stock performance, their stock started going up and up and up at the same time as Schwinn's was going into bankruptcy. And John gives a lot of credit to that. They just talked to the right people and they admitted their mistakes and then got them involved in the conversation.
I think that's great advice to, talk to the right people, admit your mistakes, and then just start plugging away, start moving forward. Don't put anything, out. I want to throw you a curveball here and ask you, because I know on the side you jazz, and that's a hobby of yours. Do you find that builds your energy, and that's something, since you have something totally separate from leadership and consulting that you can do, does that kind of come into play? And do you have stories and advice that come out of something like that you can feed into your career?
Yes. How much time you got?
We got a few minutes.
No, I'm kidding. Yes, it's not only is it refreshing to have, in fact, my horn, I can see my horn as we're talking, and I've already had it in my hands today. I'll get a chance to play it a little bit more later on. Yeah. It's energizing for me, just as this conversation and the other work I'm doing is energizing, but they feed off of each other. And there are a couple of things that is amazing. In jazz, for the most part, you have a structure. Everybody agrees we're going to play this song, and we're going to play it at this speed, in this key. But within that, you have a lot of freedom. And there are times when you don't agree, and you're in the middle of a song. And if you're in a performance, you just don't stop. So how do you get back on track? How do you pay attention? And the techniques are different, but the attitude of going, oh, isn't that interesting? And then doing stuff to get back on track or to make it, to add more vitality is the same thing in music as it is in the work that we do. But I'll tell you one other story that's really had an impact for me. And this, my clients just immediately got it. I had a thing about 15 years ago where I was working on a lot of big change projects. I don't do that anymore. I'm really focused on just advising planning groups and leaders just on, so how are you going to build support, and then being a devil's advocate in that. Anyway, I had 3 big projects. All of them were awful. They were lucrative and they were awful. And there were a lot of reasons why they were awful. I shouldn't have said yes to one of them because I just wasn't interested in the work, which is just a really bad call on my part. And the other couple, they got into this in bad faith with each other. Union and management both said, "Oh yeah," but they had no desire to work together. So, to keep this a short story, I thought, what if I only took projects on that I thought would give me as much pleasure as music? Now, for me, pleasure in music is playing gigs and all that, but I haven't played a gig in a year and a half. Picking up my horn and practicing gives me pleasure. Just doing the music gives me pleasure. And when I've told that, I remember the first client I told that to is a chemical engineer. And he said, "Yeah, Rick, I've always wanted to write a novel." And I'll get these clients who I think, well, no, they're doing what they were born to do. And that may be true, but they'll often say, I've always thought about blah, blah, blah. And they start to get excited. So one of the things that I say to myself is this work that I'm about to take on going to give me as much pleasure as music? And obviously, if you work for somebody else, you can't always say no, but sometimes you can. And sometimes you can say, I'll take that on, but what I think might make it a better project is if we did blah, 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 because I'm really paying attention to my own energy. Because if, as a leader or a project manager, or whatever, if you don't have energy going on, man, that's going to translate.
Yeah, for sure. And, I found the same thing, like being able to do something, for me, it's not music, but it's something else, doing some kind of activity, some kind of physical activity, whether it's playing pickleball or golf or something else that's going to give me that break and that's something that I enjoy that I can also bring to it. And I like what you said, if it's not a project that you enjoy as much as, then why am I doing it? And asking those tough questions and figuring that out, I think it's an important concept to take into it. And I found so many people in tech that are, their energy is low, like we've been talking about, or maybe they're burned out, and you ask them, what do you do outside of work? And there's nothing. There's nothing that of substance out there. And I always try to find, well, what is that one thing you can start doing, or maybe pick up what hobbies have you always wanted to do? Like you're talking about that guy wanting to write that novel that you can also do that will bring value into your current everyday and also give you that energy boost.
Yeah, I love that. It's a thing that I ended up putting in the new book, and I think the listeners might find this interesting. That when I used to teach motivation and leadership, I started asking a question. I said, so just take out a sheet of paper. Mm-hmm. Think about a job that you had in your life that you just loved. You loved going to work. And it could have been something you had in high school or college. One time I had somebody who had been a roadie with the Grateful Dead. I won't tell you what was so pleasurable for him, but people had these lists. And then I would say, all right, so what's on the list? And always it was the project mattered. I loved the people I worked with. I had a lot of latitude to use my own thinking. There was just a number of things. And what I would suggest to people, and this is what I'm doing in the book where I lay it out, but I'm laying it out for people right now. So is you just say, yeah, that was a great job. It made a lot of money or it was secure, but I loved going to work. Most of the time I loved being at work. And then look at the projects you're working on now and say, can I superimpose that list over top of what I'm doing right now? And if the answer is no, then that may tell you something about the quality of that project or that change or whatever that you're working on. Because the stuff people came up with was not, except for the Grateful Dead guy, it was not earth-shattering. You like the people you're working with. The project actually mattered. Your brain mattered. What people valued, what you were bringing to the table. None of that is, outside of what we ought to be doing at work anyhow. And it gives a personal way to look at a situation, and just like me with music, and you can go, that ain't going to do it.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, Rick, it's been a great conversation. How can people find out more about you and pick up that new book that you talked about and connect?
Great. Thanks for asking that. My website is rickmaurer.com, and it's RickMaurer.com. And if you go to the homepage and you wait a half a second and look in the lower right-hand corner, there'll be a link to access Seizing Moments of Possibility. You just put your email address in and the book appears. So you're not going through a bunch of hoops. There's no sales call at the end of that. I wrote the book because I wanted people to use it. So I'm not offering it on Kindle because you have to charge money for it on Kindle, even though it's not much. I wanted something that would be free and that people might say, wow, I like this. And they could tell their team, hey, we ought to get this book. And the idea is that it's saying, how do you seize moments of possibility, the kind of things we've been talking about? And there are like 9 application activities in there that you can use alone or you can use with a planning team. So I hope people will take a look. Or if you have questions about what John and I've been talking about, send me an email, give me a call. I actually love talking about this stuff. And you can get my email address on the web. Well, it's rick@rickmaurer.com, or you can get my phone number from the website too, rather than people having to write that down right now. But I'd love to hear from people.
Yeah, awesome. And I'll link that up in the show notes at geekleader.com. So we'll link to
super
to your website so people can get to that book. And I'll title it under Seizing Moments of Possibilities, so that way they'll know exactly where to go and get there.
Good. Thank you.
Thanks so much. I really appreciate having you on.
Oh, it's been a real pleasure, John. I appreciate it. So good. Thanks a lot.
If you enjoyed that episode, please leave a rating and review in Apple Podcasts. I'd greatly appreciate that. And also, don't forget to check out merch. We have some T-shirts that I've designed that are on at geekleader.com. You can click on the merchandise section there and check that out. And also, don't forget about the books from our guests. So if you like this guest and other guests that have written books, please go ahead and check that out at geekleader.com. I would greatly appreciate it, and I'm sure they would too.